Dear Father in heaven, we invite your Holy Spirit as we open your word together and as we study the history of Samuel Snow's letters. We ask, Lord, for enlightenment that comes from your Spirit and from your word. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I think we're starting to get, going through Ezra, we got a little bit better understanding of the calendars and how they work. And it's important when we start looking at Samuel Snow's letters, which we're going to do today, because these dates are important, and we're putting these dates on a line. But in order to understand these dates, we need to know what they are in the Jewish calendar. And as you know, as you've worked through using the Torah calendar, that it actually produces a different calendar than the biblical calendar, because they observe the moon each month, where in a biblical calendar, the first to the 6th months are 30 and 29 days, and also then the last months of the year are observed. Also, they're different in how they determine which month is the first month of the year. So they can have the first day of the first month begin before the spring equinox, where in the biblical calendar, it always occurs after the spring equinox. And in 1844, we know that April 19th is 1 month later than the rabbis and the Karaites had it, because the Millerites misunderstood the Karaite calendar, believing that they always commence 1 month after the rabbis. But in God's providence, they chose the correct year in which to do that, or God chose the correct year. He chose 1844, which in that year, the spring equinox precedes the end of the 12th month. And so that means there had to be a 13th month added that year. And so the Millerites did that. Also, even though they were uncertain as to how to count the months, do they observe the moon every month, or do they just go 30 and 29 like the rabbis? They chose to go 30 and 29. So they counted 177 days from the first day of the first month to the end of the last day of the 6th month. And then they had 10 extra days to the Day of Atonement. So they counted 187 days, including the first day of the first month. And that was correct. Where if they had gone by the Karaite method of observing the new moon in October, they would have started the Day of Atonement on October 23rd. So God led them, even though they didn't fully understand. And we know from what Parminder's been teaching us that God gives us knowledge that's sufficient. And then there is some knowledge, mistakes that we make that is sinful neglect. But God sometimes overwrites even those mistakes in His providence to work out His purposes. And that's what He did in many different ways in the Millerite time period. Now you have your booklet, The Midnight Cry. So this is the chapter from the Three Angels' Messages source book. So if somebody has that, they could use that, though the pages would be different. And we're going to look specifically at Samuel Snow's letters. Now, the way that I had my course set up is there was 6 lectures. And they ended up giving me 2 worships on Friday and Saturday. Now, how many people are here on Sunday still? Okay, who's not here Sunday? Okay, so there's just one person. Because what I'm going to do is, I made an executive decision, I figured I can because I'm the teacher, that Friday and Saturday night I'm going to review specifically Samuel Snow's letters and the line that I drew out yesterday, the midst of the week. So Christ's week in much more detail than we've ever looked at it before. And I'm going to do that for Friday and Saturday night so that more people can see that. Plus, it would be a good review for us. So some of what I figured I'm going to do here is we're going to go through all of the letters, at least in some way or another, today. So instead of just going through the first and second letter, we're going to look at the third and the fourth. And then on Sunday, for those of you that are here, we're going to discuss the implications of everything. And some of that will be discussed Friday night and Saturday night as well, or evening. And then on Sunday, we're just going to kind of tie up all the loose ends. But some of that may be done in the evening worships, in the Vespers. So, I just don't know how that's going to unfold, because God keeps showing us things that we never saw before. But I figure we could review everything on Sunday, answer a lot of questions, go over the things that we really, are interested in about what we studied, in this 2-week course. So we're going to look at Samuel Snow's first letter. So the first letter is on page page 10. So last year was the first time we started looking at Samuel Snow's letters. Now this one, Samuel Snow's first letter, we knew about it for at least a year before that. Probably even some people may have known about it longer than that. I knew about it at least a year before that. I didn't know that he had another letter on May 2nd. I didn't know that he had a letter on June 22nd, and I didn't know he had a letter on July 8th or June 27th, published June 27th. And I didn't know he had a letter published on July 18th. So I didn't know about those other letters. So we knew about this first letter. So we knew that Samuel Snow had understood before the first disappointment that Jesus wasn't going to come back in the spring, but that he was going to come back in the fall. So back here on February 16th, Samuel Snow writes his first letter. And what date was it published? It's in the back at the end of the letter. Okay, so February 22nd. And if you look at the bottom of that, when was it republished? It says at the bottom, after the letter, there's a footnote.
April 3rd.
So April 3rd. So this letter has it's a 3-step letter. You write it, you get it published, and then you have it republished. Now, when it was first published in February 22nd, it was published in the Midnight Cry. So it says February 16th at the end of the letter. The beginning of the letter, it says it was published in the Midnight Cry, February 22nd. And then at the end of the letter again, it tells you that it was published in the Signs of the Times on April 3rd.
Sorry?
What's that?
Where
At the
is-
beginning of the letter, page 10,
Oh, page
at the top, letter from Samuel, from S.S. Snow, Midnight Cry, February 22nd, and written February 16th in New York. And then it's published in the Signs on April 3rd. And the Signs and the Midnight Cry, the Midnight Cry is published on Thursdays and the Signs is published on Wednesdays. So the dates that these letters are published are, in a sense, determined already by publication dates. So the Millerites can't decide, we're going to publish it on this date or that date. They just publish things. Yes, you have a...
What were the newspapers, the article, and the days they published? Midnight Cry on...
It was published on the 22nd of February.
No, I mean Thursdays?
Oh yeah, so the Midnight Cry is published on Thursday, and the Signs of the Times is published Wednesday. So the Signs is first, and then the Midnight Cry newspaper, yes. And you can tell that if you look in his, like on page 13, there's a letter that's published May 2nd in the Midnight Cry, and across the page is a letter published on May 1st in the Signs of the Times. So you can see that the Signs is published on the 1st of May and the Midnight Cry published on the 2nd of May. And if you look up those dates on your calendar converter or some other program, you'll find that May 1st, 1844 is a Wednesday, May 2nd, 1844 is a Thursday. So these dates, in a sense, are predetermined by some arbitrary selection of when they're going to publish these letters. And so God in his providence could work with this. He could work with human decisions on when these letters are published. Yes?
Sorry, I don't understand. February 22 it was published in the Midnight Cry,
Yeah.
but what is April the 3rd?
That's when it was published, republished in the Signs.
Okay, republished.
Yeah, and it was
Okay.
republished with the disclaimer. So we're going to look at that.
Okay.
But I just wanted to put out these dates here before we start looking at this letter. So Samuel Snow's writing to Brother Southard, and he says, I wish to present a few thoughts for the careful consideration of the dear brethren of the Advent faith on a point wherein I differ from many of them, that is, the determination of the prophetic periods. This I would do not because I seek controversy, far from it. Let there be no strife between us, for we are brethren. Nor do I seek to discourage those who, with earnest desire, are looking for the appearing of our blessed Master within the present Jewish year 1843. Nor yet have I any desire to put the glorious day afar off. My whole soul breathes forth the prayer, Come, Lord Jesus, and come quickly. But the Lord has shown me, I think, that we must wait and suffer a little longer. So now he's going to lay out his reasons. And these reasons are, as we're going to find out when we go through them, he believed that the 6,000 years ends in the fall of 1844. And that's because he believes it began in the fall of 4157 BC. So he believes that this goes from the fall of 4157 BC to the fall of 1844. So that's his reason. Now you can see if you add those together, you get 6001, and then because you're adding numbers BC and AD, you would subtract 1 because there's no 0, but there is a 0 in your math. Right? If you were subtracting numbers BC and AD, you would add 1 to compensate for the fact that there's a 0 in your math, but no 0 between BC 1 and 1 AD. Now, we're not going to read all of this, but he has these arguments, and these arguments are such that he thinks that the harvest should be in the fall, and since Adam and Eve, are going to live on fruit, that it's going to be reasonable that it's ripe in the fall. Now, what's the problem with that argument?
All throughout the year for
There's
starters.
no fall. There's not a fall there,
Yeah.
right? In before the flood, there's no spring, summer, winter, or fall. I mean, they're living basically in a veritable paradise greenhouse. It's like living on a tropical island like Jamaica.
And all the fruits were created with fruit. When God said, let this
Yeah, they would just have fruit. So, and then he makes another argument, which is his first one. The current opinion of chronologers, both Jewish and Christian, is that it began in the fall. And what's the problem with that argument?
The opinion is what began in the fall?
Of all the chronologers, both Jewish and Christian. So that's the current position that was happening at the time. Most of the chronologists believed that creation occurred in the fall. So what's the problem with that argument? If it's just the opinion of chronologists, what's it based on? It has to be based on some evidence. Just their opinion is not an argument. Right? And they might be using the same arguments he's using or something. So it's not really a great argument to me. And the idea that the year began in the fall, I mean, it does go back a long time, but it doesn't go back to creation. It's just something that people developed over time of why they believe that the earth was created in the fall, or the year began in the fall. And it has a lot to do with the Jewish calendar, the later Jewish calendar where they start the year in the fall. So it's kind of a circular argument.
Doesn't it also have to do with the Exodus?
Well, so he makes this argument. The next argument is that, well, when God says that this month, which is in the spring, is going to be the beginning of months, then that means some other month must have been the beginning, and that would have been the fall. So what's the problem with that argument? Anybody think? So God says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, this month shall be to you the beginning of months. So the reasoning is, well, if this month is now made the beginning, then some other month must have been the beginning, and that would have been in the fall. So why would that argument be a faulty argument? Or do you agree with it?
It has a 1 out of 11 chance of being correct.
Right, so maybe it was some other month other than Tishri. But actually, if you look at it, there's no evidence that they started the year in any particular month. Because the idea of a year, beginning and ending, either had to do with a person's life, so you would count the years based on, I've been alive, if I was born in a certain month, then I would count the year based on how long I've been alive. Or you might count it later on. They used the king's reigns to count it, or some event. But God is just dealing with the religious calendar here. He's for the first time counting. And if some other month had been numbered, we would find this clearly marked. Now, some people would use the story of the flood, but when you look at the story of the flood, it appears that they're actually counting the months based on the age of Noah. So when the flood happens, it happens in the second month of his 600th year, and then when he takes the roof off the ark on the first day of the first month, he's 601. And so it's marking it, or appears to be marking it, more based upon Noah's age rather than upon any numbering of the month. Does that make sense? And that seems to be the way it is, so that until the Exodus, they never numbered the months. There was no start of the year. You would just start the year wherever you wanted to. There was no reason to have a start of the year in any other time. So again, it's not really a great argument. Now, another problem is, how does he get to 4,157 BC for creation? Anybody know? Where does this come from, this number?
Jews? I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Okay, so Miller came up with this number. And if you've ever studied Miller's chronology, it's a little bit of a mess. So Miller wanted the date 6,000 years to end in 1843. And Ussher's dates had 4004. So Miller went through Ussher's chronology and just basically added these extra years in different places. And some of them, it doesn't even make sense what he did. The one that he did, if you turn to Acts chapter 13, this is one that, well, even in this message, it was an established truth at one time, that this interpretation of this text. So Acts chapter 13, starting in verse verse 16, Paul gets up and starts talking to these people here in the synagogue. And he says in verse 17, "The God of this people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt, and with a high arm brought he them out of it." So this is about God calling the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. "And about the time of 40 years suffered he their manners in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he divided their land to them by lot." And then it says, "And after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. And afterward they desired a king. And God gave them unto them Saul the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. So here he has this statement in verse 20, "And after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until the Samuel the prophet." So what does this verse appear to be saying? If you read it. So they have the 40 years that they're in the wilderness. So if you looked at this and just did straight reading, you'd have 40 years in the wilderness. And then it says, after that, about the space of 450 years, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. And then they're marking 40 years here for Saul. Right? Is that what it appears to be saying? So this is the wilderness. And 450 years in Saul. Right? So that's what it looks like it's saying. Now, if we actually study 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, let's go there, we find a contradiction between the reading of this and what it says in 1 Kings. So,
What verse?
chapter 6 verse 1.
First Kings?
Yeah, 1 Kings. And it says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So, if we're going to put Saul, David here, and then Solomon, it's saying that from this point, this is the temple's foundation, to when the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. Now, most people then would take this verse and read it here, because this is when God brought them out of the land of Egypt. But this is when they came out of the land of Egypt. And if you read in the Hebrew, there's a difference of them being brought out and them coming out. So I'm going to mark it here, but some people try to mark it here. But what it's saying is that from here to here is 480 years. So do you see a problem between 1 Kings and Acts 13:20? Only in the math. So there's all kinds of interesting solutions that people make with this. Some people say that this 480 years is not really 480 years. It's a longer period, but it's called 480 because it's the period of time in which they were actually faithful to God, from the time that they left Egypt until the laying of the foundations of Solomon's temple. But that'd be a really strange way to read it. But also, if you go through the period of Judges, you find that it's not 450 years. So this is one of the things that William Miller was using, is he was using this longer chronology. So 450 plus 84, how many years is that different? So if I go, so this is 450 and 84. So how many years is that?
534 total.
Yeah. Minus 480. Oh yeah, right, 54. No, I'd add, yeah, right, 54, never mind. yeah, so 54 years difference. That's what we have. Okay? So what we'd have to do to make this correct is this would have to be 396 years to be the right amount. And actually, if you go through the period of Judges and you count it, it's 396 years. So, now some people try to make it longer by counting things differently, but that's the time of the period of the Judges. So the period of the Judges is not 450 years, it's 396. So how do we deal with Acts chapter 13, verse 20? Well, if you have other translations, you'll find they translate it differently. But the King James translator, when he translated it literally what it reads. And what it says, well, the problem is the Greek isn't written like English. So sometimes when you translate a sentence structure, literally, it gives the impression that it's saying something that it's not. And I would assume it's just because he was so used to reading Greek and switching the sentences around in his head that he actually didn't realize that people would read it wrong. And here's how it should read, or the way that we should understand it. Now it says after that. So that after that is not after they brought them out of the land of Egypt, but after that God called this people of, or chose this people of Israel. So when God, the God of this people of Israel, chose our fathers. So when was that? When did God choose the people of Israel?
When they were in Egypt.
Well, he chose them before. He chose them in the time of Abraham, right? So if we understand it that way, and he's talking about the space of 450 years, he's going back to the time of Abraham, and he's counting the 450 years all the way up until what time then would he be doing that? After that he chose our fathers, and he gave unto the judges, so that about the space of 450 years should go with the after that. So the way that it would read is you'd go after that, and then you put some brackets and say about the space of 450 years, God gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. Does that make sense? So all I'm doing is changing the sentence order and putting the right clauses together. And that's actually implied in the Greek. It's just that you have to put English sentences in the right order for them to be understood. So God gave them judges, but he didn't, the 450 years is not before the period of judges, or not, it's not the period of judges itself, it's the period before the judges, from the time of Abraham. So when were how long were the children of Israel in Egypt? Or how long is the period of sojourning? So let's do it this way. So this is the sojourning. Okay, so they were in Egypt 215 years. And they were in Canaan 215 years. The sojourning of the children of Israel is 430 years. But they were actually only 215 years in Egypt. Now how do we know this? Okay, so if you, well, there's a simpler way to do that. I mean, well, maybe that's the simplest way, is you read the appendix to Patriarchs and Prophets. But if you read in the Bible about the descendants, so Levi has some descendants that they mark the age of these descendants going to Moses and Aaron. So now I haven't usually showed people this, but if we go to Exodus chapter 6, so some people read this, there's a sojourning of the children of Israel in Egypt. This is actually included as their entire sojourning, and it's just referred to as Egypt, even though this is Canaan and this is Egypt. And in Exodus chapter 6, it gives the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations, verse 16. And says how old Levi was. Levi lived 137 years. Right, so that's in verse 16. So we'll put this here. So we got Levi. How many did it say? 136? 137. Yeah, so Levi's lived to be 137 years old. And Kohath, which is his son, in verse 18, he lived 133 years. So we got Kohath. And then we have next one. Yeah. In verse 20. Oh yeah, he's at the end of that. Okay. 137. So another one's 137. Amram. And then we have Aaron is going to be born, right? And Aaron's born how many years before they come out of Egypt? Right, so 43, so you got Aaron. I guess I should let you answer these questions. But if you add these all up, so you're going from Levi. Now, Levi, of course, wasn't born when they entered Egypt, right? And we're going to assume that Levi didn't have Kohath when he was 137, and Kohath didn't have Amram when he was 137, and Amram didn't have Aaron when he was 137 or 133, 137, right? So we know that there has to be some overlap. But if we just added these up, this would be 6, 8, 450 years. And so there are some people who argue that what Exodus is talking about is that that's the ages of Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron from the time that Aaron is born to the time that, or Levi is born to the time that Aaron dies, and that's the 450 years. But does this make sense to you, what's happening here? Okay. So the fact that it's exactly 450 years, in Acts it says about the space of 450 years, but some people make this argument that that's what those are, is that's the number of, you know, I have a hard time conceiving of it, but it looks, you know, it looks kind of seductive, I guess, is for lack of a better word, if somebody is just going to be playing around with numbers and not thinking about it. Because we know Levi, when he entered Egypt, he wasn't born. He would have been, you know, 40 some years old, right? So that means they couldn't have been in Egypt for 450 years unless Levi had been born, and then his next son was born the year he died, and then there was born the year he died, and then it would add up to 450. So, but it is possible, now some people have done this, and that Paul is just referring to all these 450 years, but again, I still don't think the language doesn't make sense. So what we'd have to say is that this doesn't work, that they couldn't have been in Egypt for 450 years. Plus here we have, this is when Jacob enters Egypt, when Joseph is 39 years old, right? And, you know, someday, you know, you can go through my notes and look at this chronology here. But it's a very important chronology because it sets up the whole idea of these chiasms. And so God has given us this. So all we have to do is just read Acts 13 verse 20 differently, and then it agrees with 1 Kings 6 verse 1. So I know that was kind of a detail. I'm not going to go that detailed through it, but I just wanted to show you that the 6,000 years that Samuel Snow is using, all of his arguments have a problem with them. The basic problem is they're not correct, right? So he's using faulty arguments to try to prove something. Now, he then uses the 2520. So on page 10 it says, at the bottom of the first column, the 7 times of Moses in Leviticus 26 amount to 2520 full years. And when you look at it, he makes the argument that Manasseh must have been taken captive in the fall. Well, one is that it'd be a very difficult thing to prove, and he uses some arguments for it. But I think it's probably not correct. I don't think Manasseh was taken captive in the fall, but he could have been. So, it's not impossible.
What's Miller's argument too? Wasn't it Miller's argument when he spoke about the times that the kings went to war and those kind of things?
Yeah, the next one with the 2300 days you're talking about?
With Manasseh too, I think.
Well, he's got the kings right. With Manasseh, he has Esarhaddon. He just connects he says that Esarhaddon would have been taking all the people out of northern Israel and repopulating it. And so he couldn't have taken Manasseh captive in the spring. But the thing is, he could easily take him captive while he's doing that. It's not like he can only do one or the other. Actually, it would be most likely he would do them at the same time. While he's repopulating the land, bringing people there, he's also collecting these kings, 22 of them, that he brings to Babylon after he rebuilt it in 678. So he's bringing them, and then he has them haul timber in 677. So it would make sense that he would actually bring them much earlier. He's not going to, and if he's going to bring them captive, it's going to take a few months to get them to Babylon. So you would probably take them in the spring. So it's just not a great argument to prove that the 2300 days and the 2520 are going to end in the fall. Now he uses the 2300 days. So at the bottom of page 10 on the right column, that paragraph there, he uses the 2300 days. Now, this of course is a good argument, except that almost everything he says about the 2300 days is incorrect. So let's look at it. Let's read this here. It says, the 2300 days of Daniel 8 began with the 70 weeks in BC 457, but they did not begin with the first day of that year. Now we can agree with him there, that the 70 weeks aren't beginning on the first day of the first month. It is true that Ezra began to go up from Babylon on the first day of the first month, but this was not in the year BC 457. So what's the problem here? What's he saying? He says it's not 457 that Ezra went up from Babylon to go to Jerusalem. So is that correct? He's wrong, okay? So he has the wrong year. But in the year 456, so he puts it 1 year later. Now, this is even a bigger problem. I mean, it creates all kinds of problems. And he says that that's the 7th year of Artaxerxes in which Ezra went up. Began, according to Dr. Hale's analysis of 457, in 457 and ended in 456. Now, he misread Dr. Hale's. Now, does anybody know who Dr. Hale's is? That's not Apollos Hale. This is an astronomer and a chronologist. And when he says this, what year is he describing? He's describing 457 BC. That's because he's using a 0 year, right? Because he's an astronomer. And astronomers can't have 0 years. And they use these negative numbers. And so Samuel Snow misread or Dr. Hale's chronology. And so he thought he was saying that he traveled in the year 456. So, these are things that they have to sort out. As again, they don't have the internet and they don't have all these resources. So they're getting this from books and different things they've read, and sometimes they make mistakes. So this is one of those mistakes. And then he says that it has been the practice of chronologers to count the years of the reign of monarchs by the year in which they began to reign, making that their first year. And according to BC 457, in which the 7th year of Artaxerxes began, is counted as his 7th year. Well, that's true, but it's just that he doesn't even really understand the counting of the years, like where they start spring or fall or anything. He's just kind of doing a really general sort of count. Now, it appears from the best light we can obtain on this point that he began his reign in the autumn. So he does mention that it's in autumn, but of course that's not true. Artaxerxes would have counted his reign in the spring. Okay? So in order to get it in autumn, he would need to have other arguments. Now, the other thing that's really a problem, and he says just a little bit further down, but this is not the point from which to date the 70 weeks. The decree to restore and build Jerusalem must have been issued from the king before this. And then he says, from Esther 2, verse 16, we learn that she was made queen in the 10th month of the Jewish year in the 7th year of the king. Now, this could not have been in the year 456, for the 7th year expired before the 10th month of that year. So what is this argument he's making? Who is the king that he understands as Artaxerxes? He's taking Ahasuerus from Esther and believing that that is Artaxerxes the first. But the Ahasuerus in Esther is Xerxes. So he doesn't understand the correct king. So I don't even know how he could, do the chronology in this case. But this is the reasoning he's using. And so anyway, when he goes through and he does mention the 1290 and the 1335, but his main arguments for it being in the fall really are not the arguments that he used later. He's not dealing with the types, the spring and fall types. He's got the wrong information, and he uses some of these arguments later, but he refines them, and the main argument that he's going to have has to do with that he even comes to incorrectly as well, but he gets the right answer, is that Jesus is crucified in 31 AD, and that the midst of the week becomes his main argument. And we're going to see that. So here he has this light. Jesus is coming back in the fall, but he doesn't really have it sorted out. He doesn't really understand all the implications of this. He does understand there's the 70 weeks, but he's not using the types. He's just, giving some initial ideas. So this is in February 16th. And let's look now at his second letter. Well, actually, if you flip the page, we're going to have another letter, which we don't count, but we're just going to look at it. And I've thought about it quite a bit, whether I should count it. And there is significance in when it's published. But we don't know when the letter was written. And this letter was published May 2nd. So where's the first day of the first month? So it's in between here. So we got the first day of the first month, which is April 19. Let's get over here. So this one, these other ones are published, written and published before the first disappointment. The second letter is written probably after the disappointment. We don't know when it was written. We only know when it was published. But before that, there's another letter, and it's published in the Signs on May 1st. So that's on page 12. And I'm not going to read the letter, but you could read it if you want to. In this letter, he's talking about the mockers. So I would assume then it must be written after the disappointment, because he's dealing with these people who have been mocking them. And let me see here if there's just one sentence I could read. I probably should. Okay, just let's go to the second column about halfway down. And he says, another statement that is that some of the leaders of Millerism have enriched themselves by means of popular credulity. This is given as a well-known fact. If indeed it be so, it is most certainly susceptible of proof. Then let it be proved. Assertions are not proof. And so he's saying that one of the things is that these people are, so they've been attacking Millerism based as it's some kind of spiritualism, it's some kind of, people are being mesmerized, so they're being hypnotized. And also that the leaders are making themselves rich. Have you heard of anything like this in regard to this message? These kinds of attacks?
Oh,
Yeah. So we have similar attacks against us. And especially last year. So for those of you who were around last year, when that group left, did we hear that we were teaching spiritualism? Did we hear that we were enriching ourselves?
yeah. Yes.
Yes. So this was what was happening last year. But, he's writing about it in 1844. So now, this May 2nd letter, so the May 1st letter, I'm not putting it as one of the letters, but there is a letter here on May 1st. Okay. And then we have this May 2nd letter. So the May 2nd letter is published in the Midnight Cry, so it would be published then on a Thursday, right? The other one was published on the Wednesday, the one on May 1st. And it starts out with this death warrant of Jesus Christ. Now, I was going to print out, because I wrote an article where I review the death warrant. But what happened is that Samuel Snow now has an increase of light. In May 2nd, he's going to argue that Jesus was crucified in 31 AD. That's his argument. And this allows him to look at the spring types and the fall types later on. Yes?
I hate to sidetrack, but in this article here it says, surely the seven thunders have uttered their voices.
Yes.
Do we ever take that into consideration when we look at the seven thunders, since we consider several of them to happen after this letter is written?
No, but I would actually agree with him. So that's a whole other topic. I would actually agree with Samuel Snow that the seven thunders had uttered their voices on April 19th. Mm-hmm. But I think we have misunderstood the seven thunders. And I wrote a paper on that as well. But that's... Email, yeah. What I should do is email everybody these different papers. I don't really want to print out the death warrant. It's like a 8-page paper, so it wouldn't cost much to print it out. But there I just go through and I researched all the sources I could get for this document. So basically this is supposed to be the sentence rendered by Pontius Pilate, acting governor of Lower Galilee, stating that Jesus of Nazareth shall suffer death on the cross in the year 17 of Emperor Tiberius Caesar and the 25th day of March. So he goes through and, it's obviously a forgery. It's not the actual death decree or the death warrant of Jesus Christ. And there's a number of problems with it, but one is it has the 25th day of March as the date that this warrant is issued. So what would be the problem with that? Yes,
They're not
James.
using those dates.
Well, they are using those dates. So they created that calendar. And they have the month March, right? So, but if you look at the Passover, when is the Passover?
1 month after.
So it's going to be the full moon after, but it's also got to be the new moon has to occur after the spring equinox. So on the calendar that they were using then, the spring equinox was on the 21st of March, roughly. It could be on the 20th. So you couldn't have had the first day of the first month yet. So you couldn't have Passover yet. You can't have that early of a Passover. Plus, if you look at the date, the 25th day of March, you find that it doesn't align with the days of the week in 31 AD. So if Samuel Snow is arguing that the 25th day of March is a Friday, and Jesus was crucified on a Friday in 31 AD, and if that had been correct and everything, then that would have been his argument. But it's not. His argument is the 17th year of the Emperor Tiberius Caesar. But when you look in the Bible, when did John begin his ministry? Does anybody know? In the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. So the 17th year, so if the 15th year is, it's 27 AD, then the 17th year would be what year? 29. And it's not 3.5 years. So this doesn't work. And actually, I'm not sure how anybody could use this document, if they just looked at it a little bit. But Samuel Snow used this. This document was his main argument, and he used it even years after he left Adventism and considered himself to be Ezekiel the prophet. He was still using this document. This is like one of his main themes had to do with this covenant week and this document. So it's kind of interesting that he used this document because it is fake news. Now, so I'm not going to go much else into all the different arguments here that he uses, but this was then determined to be the PBM. So this is last year, early in the year, that Elder Tabo is presenting the prediction before midnight, and he's using this May 2nd letter as this increase of knowledge that is the prediction before midnight. So this to him becomes the symbol of what's happening. Now, that's when we start to discover, so he knows about this letter, but we start to discover that one is this letter is published twice. So this is in the Midnight Cry, and this is in the Signs. And this here, of course, is in the Midnight Cry magazine, right? So put the exclamation mark. And then he's going to have these, and I'm going to look at these right now, so we're going to kind of skip ahead. So we're going to find that there's a letter that's published on June 27th, but it's going to be written on June 22nd and then published June 27th. So this is his third letter. And then we're going to have the fourth letter that's it's actually written, here I'm going to put it over here. So I could probably do this like 1A, 1B, and then 2, that's just 2, 3, I don't know how to do this. So the A is when it's published. And then there's this one written June 29th. And this is the fourth letter. And it's published on July 18th. 3 days before July 21st, which is the 5th day of the 4th month. Oops. Now, this date, we're going to look at these dates here. So we know this is the 1st day of the 1st month. This is the 5th day of the 4th month. This is what we call midnight. This is when the letter is written. It's written 3 days before, or published 3 days before midnight. It's written here, June 29th. Then there's this third letter that's written June 22nd and published June 27th. And we're going to look at these dates in a bit more detail. So let's go to page 17. So this third letter has some very interesting content, and I'm just going to read here what he says. So it's in the first paragraph, page 17. It's again a letter to Brother Southard. He's the publisher, or the editor of the Midnight Cry, though Himes is the publisher. Himes publishes both the Midnight Cry and the Signs. He's the one financing all of this and organizing it. But Southard is the editor. And there's a whole bunch here just in this first paragraph, but he says, about the 1st of last January, I felt it my imperative duty to impart to the world, and especially to the Advent band, the light which my heavenly Father had given me. So he's going to go back here to the first day of the first month, which is January 1st. It's not really the first day of the first month, but it is on our calendar, right? So I just want to note that. And on the last day, on December 31st, 1843, and that letter's in here, he gave his testimony at the Boston Tabernacle, which is quite interesting. So he gives his personal testimony and talks about how God led him into this message. The next day, he says, I felt it my imperative duty to impart to the world, and especially to the Advent band, the light which my heavenly Father had given me. So he is now marking, January 1st as when God has, where he felt it's his imperative duty to share the light that he has. So when did he get the light about October 22nd, 1844? When did he first get the light? He got it before January 1st. But now he decides, after he gave his personal testimony, he now has this conviction. I know that Jesus isn't coming back in the spring. I know he's coming back in the fall. I have to start sharing this message with other people. And so that's when he begins. So you can see by February 16th, he then begins to, at least in a letter form, share it. But he has been sharing it to other people. So this is an important point. And he says, I preached accordingly, and God had blessed my soul and blessed my labors in doing so. So he believed that Jesus was coming back in the spring of 1843, just like all the other Millerites did. But he says, and this is like halfway down the first paragraph, it was necessary that a mistake should be made in regard to the ending of the days, and that this mistake should be general among the expectants of the kingdom, in order that their faith might be tried, and that a wicked world and a world-loving church might have ample opportunity to manifest their hatred to our blessed Lord's appearing, to mock and scoff and harden themselves in their sin, and ripen for their coming destruction. What does that sound like? It was necessary that a mistake should be made in the reckoning of the prophetic periods.
And was over the mistake.
Yes. So God held his hand over the mistake. He's explaining something that Ellen White later is shown in vision, but he's explaining it already here in June 22nd. Okay? And then he says, had not such a mistake been made, there are some prophecies which could never have been completely fulfilled, such as, for instance, Ezekiel 12:22, Son of man, what is a proverb that ye have in the land of Israel, saying, the days are prolonged and every vision faileth? So we're familiar with that. And also Habakkuk 2, verse 2 and 3, which we've heard of, right? Specifically these charts. Write the vision, make it plain upon tables. So he is clearly marking that this mistake had to have occurred. And he goes through and he also starts talking about the call out of Babylon. Revelation 18:4 he references in the second column. Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. Right? He also, the paragraph there, he says, after thus commanding his people in verse 45 to go out of Babylon, he proceeds in verse 46 to give them a precious word of caution and encouragement. And this is from, I'm not sure what he's referring to here. I think he's referring to Jeremiah. But unless your heart faint and ye fear the rumor that shall be heard in the land, a rumor shall both come 1 year, and after that there shall come another year a rumor, and violence in the land, ruler against ruler. What is the rumor here spoken of? It is the Advent message. And what is the first year of the message? It is the Jewish year 1843. So he starts to lay out some arguments that are very, very interesting. So I'm not going to go through the rest of that. There is an article right after that called The Midst of the Week that's published on the same date by C.S. Minor. And you'll see at the end of that one that it says it's written by Samuel Snow in Worcester, Massachusetts, June 22. And then his last letter confirming the covenant. Now, we dealt with this already, so we went through this a little bit, the idea of confirming the covenant. We dealt with the midst of the week. And now I want to look at the chronology of this and try to understand it. So, we're not going through the letters in as much detail as I had originally planned. So if we were to, this date here, April 3rd, what date would this be on the biblical calendar? For those of you that have done the assignment.
I think I was a day off. I don't know how, but
Okay, what date do you have?
15th February?
Okay, April 3rd?
No.
No, you're thinking about back here.
Hold on.
You're thinking about this. This year when he published it.
Third day, 14th day of the 13th month.
Okay, so on the biblical calendar, this is the 14th day of the 13th month. But on the rabbi calendar and the Karaite calendar, this would have been the 14th day of the first month, right? Because they would have started their year on March 21st. So if you go, 21, 22, 23, 24, you get 10, 11, because there's 11 in March, and then 12, 13, 14. So the April 3rd would be the 14th day of the first month on the rabbinic and the Karaite calendar in 1844. So this is Passover, right?
But not really.
Yeah, so not really. But people kept the Passover in 1844 on this date. Now, what date is May 2nd on the biblical calendar? What date is that?
14th day of the first
Right,
month.
because we know April 19th is the first day. So this is the 14th day of the first month, which again is Passover. But it's the correct one, right? Correct Passover. Between this is the first day of the first month. So we have here two different Passovers. Now, if you are going to accept the light of the midnight cry, what calendar are you going to have to use to see that the 10th day of the 7th month is October 22nd?
The one with the correct Passover?
You'd have to use this calendar. Now, it is true that some Millerites might have accepted, because this was something that was a late development, they might have accepted this initially, the idea that April 19th was going to be the first day of the first month. But once that date passed, most of them rejected the interpretation of the Millerites regarding October 22nd. And then they said, no, this was really Passover. That is, March 21st was really the first day of the first month. And these Millerites are way off track now. They're even inventing dates, and they're just pushing things ahead because they were wrong. And I never really believed any of that stuff anyway, because I was just, I was persuaded by them, but I knew they were going to be wrong, right? I mean, this is what people said who went through the disappointment. These are the types of arguments they use. And so when we get here, these people who are accepting this date, this dating system, they have passed this test. And so what does this show us about these two Passovers? What do they mark? Any ideas? What group accepts this Passover? The one who become the mockers. The group that accepts this Passover, what happens to them? If you look at the illustration that Ellen White uses in The Great Controversy that Parminder's been going over, or spiritual gifts, that illustration of this group that receives light. Then they continue to receive light. So this is the people who have passed the test. That's who this Passover symbolizes. So these two Passovers are really one. They're really one Passover. Because we know in the time of Christ, Judas was separated from the disciples at Passover. Right? And so these two Passovers symbolize that separation of two classes. Now we can look at some more detail here about this Passover. So one of the things about this Passover is that Samuel Snows has an article published on May 2nd that's dealing with the Passover in 31 AD, but it's published on the Passover. Right? And what he's focused upon is this chiasm. And this chiasm, what does this chiasm represent? I mean, we studied it a little bit, but what does this represent? Christ week. The covenant. He confirms the covenant with many for 1 week. In the midst of the week he shall cause sacrifice and oblation to cease. But notice that in that verse it talks about, then for the overspreading of abomination he shall make it desolate. Does everybody that Christ dies for, are they all saved? No, they're not, right? We know that we see something similar to this, at least in my mind, is we got a hill, the cross on it, and there's two crosses on either side, right? And this cross is Christ's cross, and then we have the two thieves. And one is saved and one is lost. And that's a chiasm, right? Christ's cross is a chiasm, even just physically on Mount Calvary. Right? These two classes. And when we look at this, we can say, well, there's the earthly ministration and the heavenly ministration of Christ. You know, he's ministering, first in person and then his disciples. But there is a change that happens at the cross. There's a group of people who no longer follow him. Just as the Millerite disappointment that happened in 1844, we know that there's a division. Some people are disappointed. Some people go on to receive light. Some don't. So the cross symbolizes a separation of two classes, all on its own. Any thoughts on that? Does that make sense?
There's two massive divisions, just like in Christ's time, just like with the Millerites.
Yes. So in the Millerite period, we see these two divisions. Now, that we came to understand that this is the PBM last year, but when is the PBM marked in our history? Right, remember we have 1989, and 2014, right? Does this, everybody understand what I just did here, what I'm referring to? The number of shekels. Yeah, so this is 126, and this is 126. And from here to here is 151, 151 shekels. So Parminder in 2012 said that there's going to be a Sunday law in 2014 based upon this, but Elder Jeff put a stop to it. I remember when it happened, because Parminder hadn't really finished the study. It was just one of those studies they were doing in Wales. They're looking at these things in a study group, but somebody let out a video, which they weren't supposed to do, and there's a guy on Facebook who was promoting this 2014, that Jesus was returning, something like that. He was a guy who actually was not mentally well. But anyway, we ended up missing the boat on that. I mean, one is it was a hidden Sunday law, so even if 2014 had passed by, we might not have noticed it. And even now, we still hardly believe it. But 2014 was a Sunday law because it parallels what the Sunday law is supposed to be for the priests. And that's a whole other study. Yes, Greg. Yeah.
Do you call it a failed Sunday law or a hidden Sunday law? Something that's hard to
I
find
think
or
it's-
something that
I think
never
it's hidden.
happened? It's hidden.
It's a hidden Sunday law.
All right.
Yeah, that's the way I understand it. So, but we understood that the PBM was 2014. So we were saying May 2nd was 2014. Okay, that's the way we looked at it. So 2014, but we're still trying to understand this. So we got Elder Tabo's taking May 2nd. He's saying this is the PBM. But he's not really, trying to place that in our history. There was still a lot of muddiness going on last year. There was some people talking about sunset. There were people who were rejecting the first day of the first month as being 9/11. Because we understood this is 9/11. 9/11. Right? And we know this, we were thinking of this is the Sunday law in our minds. That's how we were looking at it. And then we were looking at, over here we have the midnight cry, and this was midnight, so I'm kind of scrunching all this over here. We have the midnight cry here. And that's how we were looking at it. So a lot of this was changing how we understood these symbols. Because we had this idea that we're doing this prediction before midnight. And yet there's this increase of light that's coming in Samuel Snow's letters that are being that we can say is the prediction before midnight, because it's here when Samuel Snow declares that Jesus is coming back here. And he also declares it's midnight here. But in order to get here, he has to have these letters written and published. And so last year we're just starting to understand that. And we're starting to understand the reform lines more clearly. Some of these attacks that occurred on the reform lines were important because they got us to look again at what the problems were in our understanding of these reform lines. Now, when we look at these dates, I just want to put this here. February 22 is the third day of the 12th month. So where did we see this before? Anybody remember? What happens on the third day of the 12th month? Third day of the 12th month. Well, okay, so in 515 BC, it's the 12th day of the third month, which is March 12th. In 1844, though, it's not. This is the 12th day of the third, February 22 is the third day of the 12th month, right? Because in different years, the Jewish calendar is going to fall on different dates on our calendar. But in 515 BC, it fell on the 12th of March. In 1844, third day of the 12th month fell on February 22nd. Second day, 22nd month. Now, in Ezra chapter 6 was where we found this. And it said that the temple was finished in verse 14. The elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, and they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. And this house was finished on the third day of the month Adar, which is in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So we found that that was on the third day of the month Adar. Adar is the 12th month. And then we found in verse 19, and it says, the children of the captivity kept the Passover upon the 14th day of the first month. So we have both this and the Passover connected. So they complete the temple, and the next thing they mention is that they keep the Passover. So 40 days later, you get, in 515 BC, right? So this is in the same time. You have the 14th day of the first month, and that's going to be on a different date. The date doesn't matter. The point is, we have this happening. So Samuel Snow's letter is published in the Midnight Cry on the date of the dedication of the temple, and it's republished in the signs on the Passover. Not the correct one, And when it's published with a disclaimer. So Heim says, we're publishing this because Brother Snow wants us to publish it, but we don't agree because we don't see any prophecies going past here. And he's telling us that Jesus is coming back here, but I'm publishing it because he's got some interesting ideas in it. So that's what ends up happening. But you can see this connection, this parallels 515 BC, right? So it ties the second decree to this history. So I hope you can see that. The dedication of the temple is followed by the Passover. This is published on the dedication of the temple date, and it's republished on the Passover. And then we know that this is the Passover, but this date here is the 6th day of the 3rd month. So what date is that? When the letter's written. What date on the Jewish calendar is that, besides it's being the 6th day of the 3rd month? It's Pentecost, right? So here we have his second letter written on Pentecost, and we saw that the prophetic mirror in 457 BC, from when they have those 3 days at the river Ahava and the 3 days that they were waiting in Jerusalem after they arrive on the first day of the 5th month. So from the first day of the 12th month to the first day of the 5th month is a chiasm where Pentecost is the center. So we see that Pentecost occurs in the 3rd decree as a symbol. Now, the thing is, this is the date the letter's written. So what date is it published on the Jewish calendar? You should be able to do the math. So it's published 5 days later. So what date would this be? So we got June 22, which is the 6th day of the 3rd month. And then it's published on June 27th, which is the 11th day of the 3rd month. And everybody sees the significance of that, right? Is the 11th day of the 3rd month important? Not that we know of. I don't know of anything that happens on the 11th day of the 3rd month. But it bothered me that it was published not on Pentecost, but it was published 5 days later. I would have liked if it had been published on Pentecost, my human reasoning. But I want to show you something. Remember how we have these connections between these calendars. So this is the Julian calendar, March 12th, and this is the biblical calendar, 3rd day of the 12th month. And I was looking at this, and we'll see this, how this applies, but I decided to do this. So I doubled it. And I got the 22nd day of the sixth month. So what is the 22nd day of the 6th month on our calendar? So that means the date this letter was written, which is Pentecost, was published 5 days later, and if I take the date in which it was published and double it, I get the date on our calendar in which it was written. Okay? Now this is a little puzzle thing called a Gordian knot. And so this little Gordian knot that exists with Pentecost is very interesting to me. Somebody who likes puzzles. But does that make sense to everybody? If you take a date a letter is published and you double it on the biblical calendar, it produces the date the letter was written on our calendar. So that has to be by design, especially considering all these other dates and the significance of them. Yeah.
Do you have any other dates that occurs with?
Yes, we do.
Your witness? Okay.
Yeah, so that's the point, is we have a second witness for this. So I didn't actually do this first. This was later. So for a long time, I just didn't know what to do with this June 27th date. It just didn't mean anything to me. Now, the June 29th date is actually Pentecost in 457. And this is the date this letter's written. And so I didn't mind that so much. you understand what I'm saying? So, because you'll see in 457, all the dates are 7 days later than in 1844. So if you did your assignment for 457, and I told you what day is the 6th day of the third month, you would have found that you wrote June 29th. So that's Pentecost. So in 457 BC, that's the center of that chiasm, is June 29th. Right. So this time it's June 22nd in 1844. And then this date, well, this date is 3 days before midnight. And if anybody studied Elder Tabo's prediction before midnight papers, he shows that the 3 days is a symbol of the prediction before midnight. So there was an argument made that the July 18th letter should be the PBM. Now, of course, it's kind of, to me, a sort of nebulous argument. Why would you care which letter? We're not predicting anything by these dates, but people were arguing over these dates, and some people were saying quite cruel things about Elder Tabo for picking May 2nd, because they thought the last letter should be the PBM. Now, I was one of the persons not saying anything bad about Elder Tabo, but I was saying, well, why wouldn't we look at the July 18th letter? So I had laid out all these letters, but I had a problem. And the problem was, I didn't know what to do with this one. We find that this is, I believe, the 26th day of the 11th month. And it's just kind of out of place. It didn't fit. So I had all these I could work. I hadn't figured out this one, and I hadn't figured out this one. I didn't know why those ones didn't fit on the line. They didn't give me any significant dates, and I thought they should. So I had a dream, and in my dream, I was, like I normally have all these dreams about numbers and stuff when I have problems. And in my dream, I was like changing things into Roman numerals, and I was doing all kinds of things, writing things upside down. I was trying everything I could to make sense out of this date. And in my dream, when I got to the end of it, I had given up in my dream, and then I heard a voice say, double it. So I took the second month, the 16th day, and I'm doing what I did over here later. So I'm just saying, well, February 16th is the second month, 16th day, correct? And then I'm just going to add to this, well, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to go February 16. And so I'm going to add 2 months and 16 days to February 16th. Now, there's different ways you could do it, but the way that I did it when I got up is I just said February, so I go March and April, so that would bring me to April 16th, right? And then I would add 16 days to April 16th, so what date would I get? So I got May 2nd. Everybody see that? That if I add February 16th to February 16th, I get May 2nd. So that means from here, let's get rid of some of this. You know what this all means? So from here to here is 2 months and 16 days. Right? So I thought, wow, May 2nd is now marked by doubling February 16th. But then I was also told to double it again. So I did this. So if I add 2 months and 16 days to May 2nd, what date do I get?
July 18th.
Okay, so July 18th. So what is July 18th? It's the last day, or the last letter that he wrote. So from here to here, it's 2 months and 16 days. So what is that doing? What is that creating? A chiasm. And the chiasm is pointing to May 2nd, and May 2nd is about a chiasm, and that chiasm is the Passover. And that chiasm, the May 2nd is what we have marked as 2014. Does that make sense? So this chiasm then, when we look at the prediction before midnight, we can then say that this whole thing is the PBM, even though it's poorly named. Because now we understand that, midnight's the Sunday law. In Millerite history, it's the Sunday law, and we've already passed the Sunday law for the priests. So when we're talking about this midnight in the future, it's a different midnight. It's very confusing. Right, until we sort it out. Once we sort it out, which we see over here on this board, so we see here, this is the Sunday law that Parminder was predicting in 2014, and it's a hidden Sunday law. And now we're over here in this period, and we then can see that the 2014 is the Sunday law. But we didn't understand that till last year. So we're going to look at, some of the other things later. I'm going to go over these in the Vespers programs. Hopefully I can get through this and not confuse people. But you can see that all of Samuel Snow's letters, both the timing, the writing of them, and the content is important. Here he's writing about, he has this inspiration regarding the purpose of the disappointment. Right? He's understanding about the mockers here, in this letter. In this one, he's now further developing his idea of the midst of the week. So now he's dealing with confirming the covenant. In a sense, he's at the end of this chiasm of which this is a type. And we saw in our study of the midst of the week, which I'm going to present again, and hopefully we can understand it a little bit more when you see it a second time, the week of Christ. So to me, this is a very powerful witness to what has been happening. Our understanding of May 2nd, I believe that last year when we were understanding, and I believe that May 2nd doesn't just represent 2014. It represents a period of time from 2014 to 2017. It represents a period of 3 years. And the prediction before midnight is 3 days or 3 years. It's the number 3. And so it's represented in our history by 3 years. And so we're going to look at that again, as I said. Hopefully we'll understand it more the second time when we look at the midst of the week. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I think all the study we did on chronology will have helped us a little bit to understand this, even if we couldn't just present it. We should be able to understand the significance of it. And there's probably other significance that I didn't mention or some that I haven't noticed. But to me, this chiasm is extremely powerful. For me personally, one is because I had a dream about it. But when you have something personal like that happen to you, it's significant. But I also think that anybody who is in this message, who is a servant, who's sharing this message, God should be able to give us light, special light, through His Holy Spirit, to enlighten us to share to others. And so all of us should be able to study God's Word in this way. Not that you're going to do chronology. That's not for everybody. But we're going to study these lines and study this message, and God will give us this light because He's giving this light to a group of people, not to individuals. And none of this would matter if I was just an individual. None of this would matter, even if I knew all this and I could figure all this out, and I was just me, and I wasn't part of this movement. It would just be a curiosity. It wouldn't mean anything. So in order for this to mean something, we have to understand the purpose and the role that all of us play in this movement. So every one of us who claims to be a priest and a prophet should be receiving this type of light. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are very thankful for the light that you have shone upon our path, and for the desire that you have put in our heart to follow this light that leads to the city. We just pray, Lord, that you can encourage each one of us. We know that we all have many different struggles and questions and doubts that crowd around us, crowd our minds, that interfere with the work that you want to do. We know, Lord, that we've had sinful neglect in our personal lives, in our personal study. And we just ask for forgiveness and strength and help that we can continue to walk in the light that you have given. We pray for the rest of the day, for the meetings, and we just ask, Lord, that you can continue to teach us, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.